Good morning, everyone. My name is Vibhor, and as you know, this session is a part of our long series on DIGITx, what we're calling it a boot camp. We had first two sessions on designing a Digit service and installing Digit on 19th and 26th May. This is a third session on building a Digit service. The session will be conducted by Subhashini, who comes with close to 2 decades of experience in software development and design. And she has been working with Digit for quite some time and has an expert architect and designer or different services. She has recently rolled out another product on Digit, which we'll come to know very soon. We initially had planned for 3-session series, but then we expanded our scope and have added 2 more sessions here. One both on the building front-end UI. First one using React.js and second one using Flutter. And as we have communicated earlier, people who attend all 4 sessions, all 5 sessions now, will get a special session invite to attend in person. And those will be communicated to the folks who will know that have attended all. I will not take much of a time, just couple of logistic announcements. You can use chat for interacting with participants as well as panelists. Use Q&A session for your questions and queries. Please do respond to polls as and when they come along. And now, Subhashini, over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vibhor. Hello, namaste, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all those who have joined us today. Welcome to this webinar on building a Digit service. Thank you so much for joining. So as Vibhor has mentioned, we've had 3 sessions so far in this series. 2 have been completed and this is the 3rd session. My name is Subhashini and I'll be hosting this session with help from my colleagues. The first session was on designing a Digit service by Ghanshyam Rawat, who's here today. Say hi, Ghanshyam. So this is Ghanshyam. That was on May 19th, and on 26th, we had Aniket Talele, who spoke about deploying Digit. And today's session is sort of a continuation of that, and we are going to talk about how to actually build a Digit service. So this session is going to be a mix of explainers as well as actual code, where I'll show you the code. I'll not code from scratch just in the interests of time. And since a lot of what we are discussing is already available as videos and tutorial assets on our website. So I have some code, but I'll walk you through that. And hopefully at the end of this session, you should all have more confidence on building a new module on Digit. Let me just share my screen. So hopefully all of you can see this.
Yeah.
Okay. I need to hide this. Okay. So this is building a Digit service. Now, if you are a developer and your boss has just told you that you'll be working on a project where you have to work on this platform called Digit and you have to roll out a series of services, right? You've probably been given some materials to look at, maybe some videos, maybe some documentation, and you've gone through all of that. And at the end of it, you feel like so many new terms have been thrown at you. You're hearing things like, Zool and API gateway, unbundled, API specifications, Swagger, minimal indexer, Helm, DevOps, calculator, demand, so on and so forth. So if you are like me, when I joined eGov about a year ago, this is how I looked like. This is how I felt. I felt like I was swimming in a soup of terms and I wasn't exactly sure where to start. So if you are feeling that way, so you've come to the right place. And hopefully this session is going to make things a lot clearer and a lot easier for you. So yeah, this webinar is for you. Vibhor, if you could send out that poll, I just want to get a sense of how many of you are developers and how many of you have attended some of our earlier sessions. This is just to help us tailor our content according to the audience levels. So please do respond to that poll and then we'll quickly get started. We'll just give it a minute or so, and hopefully that will also allow others to join in this Friday. Okay, great. Looks like 72% of our participants today have attended the earlier sessions. And okay, we've got a minority who's not, where this is their first session. You worked with the Digit platform before. Okay, so many of you are new to Digit and some of you have not attended some of our earlier sessions and this is the first session you're attending. No problem. So I highly recommend that you watch the earlier sessions. The recordings are available online and Vibhor can share links to those. Highly recommend that you watch those sessions as well. The recording of this session will also be available to you later. And a lot of the resources that we are going to talk about here are also available online and we will share links with you for all those things. Oops. Okay. So broadly, this is the agenda we are going to follow today. We are going to talk about some of the prerequisites and tools required available for you to start development on Digit. And we are going to build a sample module, which allows you to basically register new births. And the API specification for that service is available with us. And I'll walk you through the API specification and how to generate Digit skeleton code from that API specification. And then we are also going to talk about workflow configuration. How do you configure workflows? How do you define master data? What are some of the nuances in defining master data? How do you integrate with some of the other Digit services? How do you test the APIs? And then finally, how you can deploy the service. I'm not sure if we'll have time to actually deploy the service, but we'll try. And I'll also share some, most commonly asked questions and what the solutions for those are. So before we actually get into the technical bit, we also need to understand a little bit of context on what is it that we are trying to do here with Digit. Many of you who have attended the earlier sessions or have read about Digit know that we are a philanthropic foundation. We are a not-for-profit foundation that builds open source software, primarily for governments for service delivery, right? So this is a mental model of one way to think of how a government works, right? A government basically has some revenue in terms of taxes, fees, fines, debts, and grants. And this is budgeted across various departments. And all these departments work, basically for the benefit of citizens. And they are supposed to produce one of three outputs. Either it is in the form of infrastructure, which benefits citizens, or direct benefit transfer, or some kind of service delivery. So what do we mean by service delivery? This is just any kind of service that a citizen has the right to avail. Things like maybe property tax, right? A citizen should be able to avail of the service of paying property tax online. Maybe it's availing a new water and sewerage connection. Maybe it's electricity connection. So many other things that a citizen can avail, fire NOC, building plan approval, things like that, right? So these are all services. And Digit is essentially a platform that enables service delivery. Of course, it can be used and extended for other purposes also, but primarily a lot of the services and the features that we have developed are kind of tailored towards service delivery at population scale. Okay. Now, if you look at service delivery, whether it's property tax or trade license or anything, building plan approval, all of them follow a certain similar framework. What is this framework? Typically, some citizen registers and logs into some portal. They apply for some services, they upload certain documents, and they pay a certain amount for that service where applicable. And then their application is submitted and they should be able to track their application through the system And finally, when their application gets approved, they should be notified and they should be able to download some artifacts where it is applicable. For example, if it's a birth registration module, maybe they download a birth registration certificate. If it is something else, then whatever is applicable to that particular module. They should be able to offer feedback and they should be supported when they have issues. And government should be able to continuously monitor and improve the process. So this is typically how any service delivery works. This is a generic model of that. So now what we are going to build today, which is the birth registration module, is also kind of a service delivery, right? And this is the sample module that we will build today. So you may be going, all this is fine, but what exactly does it mean when we talk about a digit service from a developer perspective? What is it exactly, right? So a digit service is just a simple Java Spring Boot application. So if you know Java Spring Boot, you're already 50% of the way there. So you'll be able to read a digit service and understand what it does. And what does a digit service really contain? It contains mostly 3 APIs. We follow the minimal principle, which Ghanshyam described in his first session. So we try to keep minimal number of APIs in each application. So we'll have 3 APIs, one to create, one to update, and one to search. And this service is going to have certain validations. Basically, this is common sense. Any data that comes in, you will want to validate it and make sure that data integrity is there. And then there is something called enrichments. What this means is, because this is a microservice environment, right? And there are all these different complementary services. Maybe your property tax service has a user ID for a owner, right? When you are returning a response through the API, you would want to call the user service with that user ID, fetch all the user details, and then return a response which actually gives meaningful information to the user. So that is what is called enrichment. Basically, being able to call across services, fill in the data set, whatever is needed, and sending it back to the front end. And finally, what else does a digit service do? It pushes data into a persistence layer or a data store. So ultimately, this is what it is. This is standard. Any module will have this, and digit also has this. So let's talk about what are some of the prerequisites for development on digit. So number one, you need to make sure you've got code access. Digit basically has 4 repositories primarily. There is the platform code itself, and there is the DevOps code. And then we have a configurations repository where we store all our configs. And then we have a master data management repository, which holds all the master data which is relevant to each module. We'll shortly talk about what master data is and configs is and all that. But for now, these 4 repositories you need to have access to, and you should have cloned on your system also, so that you'll be able to access it on your laptop. Okay. Information on how to clone, where to find, all that is available on core.digit.org. So you can find it, and we are open source. So all of this is available on GitHub under the e-government's organization. So please fork the code and then clone it onto your local system. So if you are part of an organization, maybe somebody, organization admin or somebody has already forked this code into another GitHub org, and then maybe you can just clone from there if you have the right access. But make sure you've got code access. The second thing, you need to have access to a digit environment, because digit is a platform. It is not a simple application. It's a huge platform with 30+ services. And you cannot run all these services locally on your laptop, but you will be dependent on them for your module to work. So if you are developing locally, you can basically just reuse services which are running in a digit environment. For example, the user service or a master data management service, localization, workflow, etc. So please make sure you have access to a digit environment. Typically, this means that somebody would have already installed digit, either in the quick start or some kind of environment in your organization. Please make sure you have access to the kube cluster for that particular environment. We are also working on a sandbox to make this easier for everybody to just leverage a digit environment that has already been installed for you, but that's in the roadmap. And when that happens, we'll make sure you all are informed. But until then, you will have to have your own digit environment. Third, you need to have a local development environment set up so that you can run your new service locally in your IDE, test things out before you actually deploy it somewhere. To run things locally, what do you need? There is something called a Persister service in the platform, and we'll talk about that shortly. You need to have access to that code. You need to be able to run that service locally. You need to have Postgres installed. You need to have Kafka. And that's pretty much it. Any other service that you want to test out locally before pushing it, you need to have it running. But primarily, you need the Persister and Kafka running locally. CI/CD setup, again, this should be part of your organization's DevOps. Some admin would have probably done it already for you. Make sure that you've got CI/CD setup. Digit ships with CI/CD, and it can be installed with one click. What this does is basically it will give you integration with Jenkins, and you can use Jenkins to build and deploy your code in your environment when you get to that stage. This is very important. Number 5 is basically you should have design artifacts. Before beginning development, you should have the high-level design, low-level design. You should have an idea of how the process works, swim lane diagrams, which your product person can give you. All these need to be available prior to beginning development. The more time you spend on design, the less time you're going to spend on development, and development will be easy. This is something we try to follow also here at eGov. So think through your design, make sure you've got an idea of how your DB is going to look. You should have your API specs ready before building the module. You should have your workflow swim lanes, and you should have some sequence diagrams that lay out how your API call flows are going to work. And this will help you develop things faster on Digit. And lastly, you need certain technology skills to develop on Digit. As I mentioned earlier, you need to know Java Spring Boot. You need to have a certain proficiency with YAML, reading and writing YAML configuration, reading and writing JSON config. You need to know database technology. We use Postgres, which is the standard worldwide for open source RDBMS. You need to understand certain REST concepts, what an API does, all that stuff. And then finally, you need to know how to work with Git. So these are some of the tech skills that you need. Before, can we send out the next poll just to get a sense of how many of you are Java Spring Boot developers here? And once that poll is done, we'll get started with dev environment setup. There are 2 questions in the poll. One is knowledge of Java Spring Boot. The other one is whether you've worked with microservices before. Again, this is just to get a sense of how we can tailor our content delivery to you. And please do post questions in the Q&A box. We have colleagues here who are monitoring the Q&A box, and they can help answer your questions. And we'll also take breaks in between the session to answer some of the questions. Okay, more than half the audience knows Spring Boot and half the audience doesn't know. Okay. And 74% of you have worked with microservices, which is great. So a lot of this you will already know. Great. Okay. So let's just jump into how to set up the dev environment. Whoops. Okay, dev environment setup. Basically, this is exactly what I spoke earlier. You need to have access to Git. You need Kafka. You need to make sure Java is installed on your system. Please install Postgres locally. For local development, you do need Postgres locally, and you can install some kind of UI, whatever works for you to administer Postgres. I have pgadmin 4 on my system. You need to have, we prefer Postman as an API testing tool. You need to have Kubernetes command line installed, and you can pick one of your development environments, whichever you prefer. I use Eclipse, and make sure that you have the Lombok plugin installed for all these development environments. So I'll just quickly show you what I have on my machine. So I'm on a Mac. And sorry, screen is not visible. Okay, one second. Share my entire screen. Okay, so I'm on a Mac and you can see I use Homebrew to install some of these packages, and you can see I've got Kafka installed, I've got Postgres installed, and Kafka comes with Zookeeper. So these three things are running and you can see the status is started. All these services are running on my machine. And I've also got pgadmin 4 installed just to look at some of these databases and things like that. That makes it easy. So make sure all these services are running locally. Now going back to our presentation. And I use Eclipse. And this is Eclipse. All of you must be familiar with it. And we'll get into that shortly. So before we actually do development and I can show you code, let's talk about API specifications. Ghanshyam mentioned that in his design session, he went into great detail about API specifications. We use Swagger OpenAPI spec 3.0. Some of our specs are at 2.0, but we are in the process of converting everything to 3.0. And at eGov, Digit basically, we believe in API-driven development because we are building a microservices platform, and it's important for services to be able to talk to each other. And for that, you need very stable APIs through which they communicate with each other. And by following API-driven design, you will basically get a sense of how things are going to come into the system and how things are going to go out of the system. And then basically you design your service based off of that. A lot of what we do in terms of API design is basically domain-driven design. It's nothing specific to eGov or Digit. Domain-driven design is a concept that was written about by this author called Eric Evans, and you can look him up on Google. There are a lot of YouTube videos also where he has given talks on domain-driven design and how to design services following certain principles. So prior to beginning development, you should have a solid API specification for your service, and that is the starting point. So for the birth registration module, I will show you the API specification that we've got. We'll walk through that and then we will generate code from the API specification. How do I get out of full screen mode here?
Just full screen.
It
was full screen.
I don't want full screen. Okay. I'll show it again. Just 1 second, Mali. Why is this in full screen?
Skip.
Okay. So I'm just going to open up the API specification. This is something that we have here. This is birth registration. I'll just put it up in the Swagger editor for easier view. Swagger. So you can see this. Everybody is able to see, right? Okay. So this is just the API specification YAML file, which I just copy pasted into Swagger. This is the birth registration service. We've got a description for what this service does. And as you can see, there are 3 APIs. There is a create API, there is an update API, and there is a search API. Okay. So if you look at the create API first, this API is used to basically create new birth registration applications in the system. So you can see that, this is how it looks like. Basically, you will pass a birth registration application object into the API, and you will receive certain responses back. And we have defined that it's going to be a 201 if it is successful. It's going to be a 400 if creation failed. We'll look at the entities that this API is following. And you have another update. Basically, again, same thing. You are passing a birth registration application object, and it is going to update it and provide certain responses. And we also have a search API, which defines certain criteria for the search. I don't know what's up with Swagger here. but we'll look at it here. So you can look at it here. So basically this is the search. For search, there are certain parameters which have been defined, which you will pass to the API, which includes things like name, application number, IDs, and you will be able to search for that based on these parameters. Hang on, Swagger. So we are having some Swagger issues, which is usually. Okay, now this is back. So we have defined a basic applicant object, which basically contains a UUID, a username, a mobile number, email ID, and certain roles for this applicant. This is basically the person who's applying on behalf of the child that has been born. This is the primary object. This is where we start, birth registration application, and you can see it has so many attributes here. We have ID, which is a unique UUID. This will be generated by the system when you submit an application. We have a tenant ID. So tenancy in Digit is basically, it's a separate topic in itself. But basically when you set up Digit, you configure tenants for your system. Tenants are typically ULBs in most of the cases where we work. So it will be something like Bhubaneswar Municipality or Jatni or Venkanal or whatever else is there, Amritsar, etc. So the tenant ID is basically where where the Digit installation has been configured, and this is something common. And this is something that we mandate in almost all the APIs in all the entities. So this is something you will know and you will pass. Application number, again, this is a unique application number. This is something that we will generate internally. Whenever a new application is submitted, we can generate it, and you can specify the format in which this application number needs to be. There is a workflow status attribute. Basically, this tells you what is the state of your application. Okay, and there is an is active field. This is basically just for soft deletes. So if you want to delete something, is active will be passed as false, default will be true. And then you will pass, the baby's first name, baby's last name. This is nothing, this is just a string, right? And you will pass all these details, and you will also pass information about the father and the mother, because these are the people who are going to be applying on behalf of the child. So we'll have these entities, which basically we need information of the father and the mother so that they can log into the Digit system and check the status of the application. Again, for the purposes of, teaching, we have done some of this. All of this may not be required in a production grade, API spec. You probably need the information of one of the parents, but we have just put it up here so that it's easy to follow along so you know what is happening. So we've got all this information, then we've got the doctor's name, we've got the hospital name, we've got the place of birth, time of birth in epoch, and then we've got an address object, which basically gives the address of the parents. We've got an applicant object, which can be used when somebody else is applying on behalf of a certain person. And audit details is nothing but it just gives you an audit trail of when this particular entity was created, modified, etc. This is done for purposes of non-repudiability. Okay, so this is very simple. And if you notice, some of the things to notice here are, we have defined the min length and max length for each of these fields. And ideally, your database design should derive from the API specification, and you should make sure that all your table columns follow these same constraints which have been defined at an API specification level. If you don't do that, then you are probably going to end up having different constraints in different portions of your system, and that may lead to problems further downstream. So when you think about, when you write your API specification, please think through this and provide the proper length so that the database design will also become easy. So this is your basic birth registration application object. And you also have this request. Apologies, we have Swagger issues from time to time, and I have not been able to figure out why this, now it shows up. So basically you have this request object, which will be sent to your create API. It contains a request info, and it contains an array of birth registration applications. Request info is This is not something that you have to define. Digit has some common contracts, which already has a lot of these entities defined, and I'm just pulling from there. You can see that it will be a reference. If I go up here, this is update. There is my create. So if you notice here, a lot of these things are predefined. I'm defining the request info object. I'm pulling the error response. How does a error response looks like from Digit? All this is already predefined and you just have to reference it. And we'll point you to where all these common contracts are there. So you just need to refer to these entities. So in request info, if you see, there are a few things: API ID, action, requester ID. The important two things are you need an auth token. Basically, you have to log into Digit and you have to have an auth token to invoke certain services. And you have to have some user info objects. I do apologize. This UI is not very conducive, but we'll see.
Open this. Read out.
In what?
Read out.
Read out.
Editor. So,
I'm just trying to open it up in a editor that's more readable. Do you have the link?
that's you can take out.
Okay, okay. So basically, request info just contains some user information, right? User information is basically what is the UUID of this user who's making the request and what are the roles assigned to this particular user. Request info object is typically populated by the API gateway, which is Zool. When you log into the system, Zool will populate this request info object in all of your calls and forward it on to the service. And that way, that's how it works. But just for purposes of explanation, I'll show it here. And we'll also populate some of this stuff directly in our Postman calls just to mock it. So that's it. So basically, our birth registration request contains a request info and a birth registration application object, which had all these entities that we just spoke about. And then there is a response object. Okay, we'll just go here in the code and see it.
I think I can do.
Okay.
You have checked in this swagger. You can directly paste the
Link, is it?
Yeah.
Or can I put
You
the,
can upload the file also if locally it is available. Click on upload file.
where is it? Yeah.
Drag and drop
So
also.
we are just trying to make this more readable for you all. Where is it? It's here. Okay. So this is a much cleaner view. Thank you, Ghanshyam. So you can see this is how the request body schema looks like. And these are the responses that are going to be sent back on search. There is a 200 and a 400. For creation, again, this is how it looks like: request info, and we are sending an array of birth registration application objects. If it is successful, you get a 201. If it doesn't work, you get a 400 with an error message. And this is the response info schema. Again, this is something that is already defined in common contracts. And you can see there are all these attributes which you can read upon. And if there are errors, those will also be defined. And that's pretty much it. Okay, similarly for update, we are going to send request info and again birth registration application, and you'll have certain responses. So this is the API spec and we'll publish it. This is already available on the core.digit.org website under the developer guide. So you can look at that, and we'll also publish the latest version. Not sure if the latest is updated there, so we'll do that. So you can look at it. Now that we have this, what we are going to do, we have tools that make it easy for you to generate a digit skeleton code, module code, right? So I'll just show you. We use Swagger CodeGen, but it's a customized version of CodeGen where we have customized it specifically for Digit. And this is a jar file that's also available on core.digit.org. So you can download it from there and use it. So if you have an API spec and you have downloaded CodeGen, you are now ready to generate skeleton code for Digit. So I'm just gonna I'm just trying to find the command easily. So we'll do it here. So basically in this Digit Bootcamp folder, if you see, I have the API spec. I also have the CodeGen jar, which I've downloaded. And now I'm just going to run it. And this command is available on the website also under the developer guide. So I'm just pointing it to the API specification. And you can provide some, package name, whatever, however you want to do this. And you just press enter. And this is going to generate some output, which we will look at shortly. So you can see that this has just run. And now in the same folder from where I ran this, I have an output. And if you see the output, you have the skeleton Java Spring Boot application. There is a pom.xml. There is a source. And you've got all this. Basically, this is the package name that I provided to CodeGen, org.egov.sample. And you can see that it's available. You can see it has created certain packages. There is an API controller for you readily available as part of that. And you can also see a lot of POJOs which have been created based on your API specification. You can see that address object has been created, applicant, audit details, birth registration application, request response, error response, all these things which basically you have provided in your API specification, we have been able to generate code for it. Of course, some custom code, all the business logic for your module, that is something that developers have to write, but this gives you the skeleton framework. So you don't have to work too hard for that. There is also a Kafka folder, which has a consumer and a producer. And if you are a Spring Boot developer, there is a repository layer that you have, and there is a config. There is a configuration object that has been created for you. So this is it. And this is something that you can just import into your IDE. I'll just show you this. So I'll just import existing Maven projects. I'll go to Digit Bootcamp, select this, open. Oh, because I already have it, is it? I don't know why I'm not able to select, but usually you should be able to select this and just click import into your workspace. And when you import it, you'll see it in a nice format. I've already done this and imported it in the interest of time. I've done it already. So you can see this is how it will look like. Basically, I had given a different package name when I did this generation. So you can see it's digit.web.models, digit.web.controllers. This is essentially what we generated now also. So I already have this module available. So we'll just walk through this module and we'll show you how to proceed. So before we do that, any questions? I want to take a pause and just ask if there are any questions that have not been answered. Then we'll take that now. Anything in the Q&A box?
Yeah, we are addressing.
Okay.
Certain things which are off topic, I'll ask to put in the discussion board.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So before we actually do, now that we have the code in the IDE, before we get into coding, let's just talk a little bit about how this module is going to work end to end. That understanding is important prior to developing any code. This is pretty much common sense that we apply everywhere. So what is the process flow for this module? And how do the swim lanes look like? Swim lane is nothing but a visual representation of the process where it lays out clearly who are the actors and what are the steps and what are the actions that lead to certain states. And this is important because this is how our workflow service is also modeled. And if you have a very good swim lane diagram, then you can derive your workflow configuration directly from the swim lane diagram. So you can see that for this birth registration workflow, right? And this is something that we got from a product manager or a product owner should be able to give you this process flow or a swim lane for a particular domain. How is the process going to work? Who are the actors and what are the actions and states? So in this case, we've got three people. We've got the applicant who's actually applying for the certificate. We've got a verifier who's typically a ULB employee. ULB stands for Urban Local Body. So this person will review the application, make sure the amount that's necessary has been paid, and they will verify the application. And the same person can also potentially approve the application. So this is how the whole thing flows. The citizen applies for a service and they are usually asked to make some kind of payment where it is applicable. And once the application is created, it goes to the verifier, and the verifier will have to verify the application. And if the application is correct and it has been verified, then this person will also approve the application. And if it is approved, then we will send a notification to the citizen saying this application has been approved, whether it's SMS or email, that is something that's configuration that we can do. And the citizen should be able to download the certificate, the birth registration certificate. This is one flow. If the approver rejects the application for whatever reason, right, then it should go back to the verifier. The verifier will request changes, and this will go as a notification to the citizen. The citizen will basically again look at what changes are required, modify the application, and then again resubmit the application. And then again, it will flow through the same thing. Again, we will go through verification, approval, etc., etc. So this is basically what is called as a swim lane. And once you have this, basically the left-hand side, you have your actors or the roles. These are your states. The boxes are your states and the arrows are your actions. And from this, we will derive our workflow configuration. Workflow configuration currently in Digit is just simple JSON. And you can configure workflows for a particular module. You can configure multiple workflows for a module. Maybe there are multiple business services. So what we call as a business is just a module. Business services, when you are creating a birth registration application, when you're updating it, when you're submitting a request to delete, right? All of these things are called business services, and each of these may go through a different workflow. So you can define multiple workflow, one per business service for a particular module. And in this case, we are keeping it simple. We only have one single workflow during the creation process, and we'll show you how to do that now. So workflow configuration, before I actually show you how the JSON looks like, this is done via a REST API. We currently don't have a UI for it. But we are working on something called the workbench, which will potentially have some of this UI, which will make it easier. And what I just mentioned, right? One per business service, each business can have multiple business services. Workflow is just a simple state machine with an array of states. Each state has certain actions that can be taken on that particular state, right? And it can be, for example, if you have applied for something, either it can be approved or it can be rejected, right? These are the actions. And these actions basically lead you to the next state. And there are roles that can perform an action. So all these things, basically, what is the action you can take? What is the state that it leads to? And who are the people who can perform that action? This is essentially what we will define in workflow configuration. And in the Digit workflow service is a simple state machine. What that means is essentially, if you perform a certain action on a certain state, it moves to the next state. That's all. A lot of the business logic that drives when this transition should happen is part of the module that you are going to write. Workflow does not come built in. For example, if you have used Camunda or some other workflow modules, right? They have a lot of complicated rules that can be designed into the workflow itself. That is not something we have done. And this is a conscious decision because we need to be able to span across a variety of contexts in the government, and our workflow needs to be able to cater to all that. So we have chosen to keep it very simple. You just define action, states, and roles, and the business module that is invoking workflow needs to make sure that the business logic is in place to transition the workflow from state A to state B. So now I'll just show you how to configure workflow. So this is Postman, okay? And if you look here, I've got the payload for workflow. Let me just paste this somewhere else so we can see it better. So I'll paste this. And you can see this here. So I've got a request info, which we will skip for the moment. I think the important thing is when you are calling the workflow API, this is the payload that needs to be sent. And if you look at it here, this is essentially exactly what I just showed you in the swim lane diagram. Tenant ID, business service, business. These tenant ID is common. We have already spoken about it. So the business is, I'm going to call my module birth registration. You can choose to call it whatever, BTR, BRT, whatever it is you want to call it. And the business services I'm going to create. So this workflow is for birth registration creation. So I've just provided it like this. You can also define SLAs for your workflow. When do you expect this workflow to be completed? You can define it at a global level and also at a state level. So you've got this, then you've got an array of states. So initially your state is null. At the beginning of the process, nothing has been done. So your state is null, application status is null, and this is going to be your starting state. This start state is true. This is not the terminal state, so this is false. And if you see what are the actions that can be taken on this state, the only action that can happen is apply, right? When you are starting from scratch, somebody has to apply for a birth registration. So the action is apply. The next state that this action will lead to is applied. So when somebody applies, it will move to the state called applied. And the person who can take this action, there are two roles that I've defined here, citizen and employee common. So a citizen can apply for something or an employee can apply on behalf of a citizen. So we have defined two roles that can perform this particular action. Now, if you go to the next state, which is applied, the application status at this point is going to be in workflow. Okay. And the actions that can be taken from this state are either approve or reject. If it is approved, then the next state goes to approved, and only the employee can approve or reject an application. Therefore, we have added only the employee role. A citizen cannot approve or reject. So the workflow itself will take care. If you have defined roles, then only that role can perform that action that is built into our workflow service. So that's it.
I have one question related to that. In the start updatable attribute, what is the significance of that? Is a start at
Whether the state is updatable, whether you
means we can edit if the person have an access to edit that particular state. Okay.
So we've got approve and reject. And final state is basically approved. Okay. And in this case, the application becomes active because at this point it has been approved, it is good to go. And you have the next state, which can be pay. You can make a payment for this. And you can see that there are certain roles defined for payment. Similarly, if it is rejected, right? And in the case of rejected, this is the terminal state. So is terminate state becomes true, the application status becomes inactive because it's been rejected, right? And that's it. Registration completed is another terminal state. So in this case, the whole process has finished. And this is also a terminal state. So this is how you can define a workflow configuration. There are many other examples of more complicated workflows or simpler workflows, and that should be available in the documentation. So please have a look at that. So this is what we are going to basically configure for our module. So coming back to Postman, I'm going to basically my tenant in the environment where I'm working, the tenant is called PG. And the business is birth registration, and this is creation. So I'll just go ahead and create this. And you can see this is the URL. And one thing to note is workflow service, if the proper role action mappings have been provided, then you can directly call it from your environment. Otherwise, please port forward. So let me see if I've already port forwarded it. So I'm just going to find the pod, the workflow pod in my environment, and then I'll just port forward it. So you can see the workflow pod here. So I'm gonna just put over and replace the pod name. Hit the port. So now my workflow service from my environment is getting port forwarded locally on port 8020. And this again, I've just done this to avoid certain, authorization things. So now you can see I'm pointing my request to port 8020 on localhost, and this is the URL that I'm going to call for workflow creation. So I'll go ahead and do send on this, and you can see I'm getting a 200 OK response. And you will exactly get a mirror back of what you posted. You have a tenant ID, UUIDs are generated, you've got all your states. This means your workflow has now been configured. Now, just to be sure that workflow has been configured, you can also search for it. Okay. And in search, you have to provide the business service name, which you gave here, right? So I'm going to take here. This is my search URL for workflow. Again, this is standard. The workflow service documentation is available on the Digit website, and you can look at it. And here I'm just going to say, give me this. My business service is birth create, and I want to find if this has been configured. It's best practice to just check once before you proceed with your code, so that you know your workflow has been configured and it is available. And it's also validation for you. So it's available. So in this case, I've configured it. It's available. So we are good to go. So this is how workflow happens. Any open questions?
There is a question whether we can create service from the scratch, a new service. Are you taking it up?
No, we are not going to be showing it in this session, but from scratch meaning how to design the API.
Create a new service from scratch. Probably, I think 2 people have asked. Maybe they want to see.
But I don't know if we are talking about designing the API specification. But if that is the case, then I think we'll do that later. Ghanshyam will probably have a session later where we get into how to design an API specification from scratch in great detail. We'll do that. He touched upon it in his design session also. If you are asking, can I just write a Spring Boot module from scratch without using CodeGen? Sure, you can do it. I hope that answered the question, or please post a follow-up if that was not the question.
Or we can take it up later.
Yeah.
You can take it up later.
After the session, we will open the.
Sure.
That people can explain what they want to understand.
Okay, so basically so far what we have done is we have configured a workflow for the module, right, from a swim lane. Next is we are going to actually get into writing the module. But before we do that, we need to understand what a persister is. So typically in any application, what do? You've got certain APIs, right? You're seeing my screen, right? You've got certain APIs in your application. There is some business logic. And this logic works on the data and pushes it to a database. This is typically how any application works. The only thing that is slightly different in Digit is you've got APIs, you've got the same business logic. Instead, the writes are posted to a queue, Kafka in our case. And we have a service which is called the Persister. This is a very developer term, persistence layer, therefore Persister. And this basically reads the payload from the queue and maps the payload to certain tables in the database. So that is what the Persister service does. Why has it been done this way? This is for reasons of performance. And also, this is a way of keeping your platform DB agnostic. Tomorrow, if you want to swap out some other database, MySQL or whatever else, right? This is easier to do when you have this layer of separation, mainly for performance, because when you have writes, they are asynchronous and they are going to a queue, and therefore we control the rate at which we can persist it in the database. This avoids overwhelming the database, especially when we are talking about population scale. So that's what the Persister service does. If you notice here in this diagram, you can follow my mouse on the screen. The business logic only writes go to Kafka. The reads are still directly going to be from the database, which means your search API is going to read directly from the database, and you will write your usual string row mappers and query builders to retrieve the data. Only the writes are getting pushed to Kafka, and this is what we are going to see in the code also. And this is why you need to have the Persister running locally and Kafka running locally for your module, so that when you push data, you can see that it goes to the queue, then it gets picked up by the Persister and persisted into the database. So this is what the Persister does. And the Persister has certain YAML configuration, which basically tells it how to map a payload to the DB table. This is not something the Persister can know for all the modules. So whenever you write a new module, you will also have to tell the Persister, this is how my payload looks like, and this is how I'm going to push it into these tables. So essentially that is the YAML configuration that we will look at. And the easiest way to understand the Persister, the payload and the YAML configuration is to look at the payload and the YAML side by side. And that is what we'll do first. So I'll show you how to write. I've already written the configuration, but we'll show you how exactly this looks like. Now, if you look here, I'll just show you this, for example, right? What you are seeing on the screen right now is the payload. Okay. Let me show you the request payload rather than the response. So this is your payload basically for a birth registration application, right? So you can see all these. I'm passing the father details, the mother's details. I'm passing some address, and I'm passing some baby's details, baby first name, last name, doctor name, etc., etc. Now, if you look at the YAML config for this, so this is the Persister configuration for this service. I'll make this big full screen. Just 1 second. So you can see this is how it is getting mapped. You can see that if you are passing an array, right? You are basically, this is just straightforward JSON path. So I highly recommend you go through some of this JSON path stuff before you get into this. There are a lot of resources available online. So we are basically just mapping it. We are saying, okay, this is your JSON path, birth registration applications.star. This basically indicates an array. Okay. And now you go back here. You are basically saying, I'm going to grab, this is your query statement. I don't know if you can see my screen properly. So this is your insert statement into the database. You can see that it is listening from a certain topic in Kafka. It's going to listen to this topic, and this is the actual query. Insert into EGBT registration, and it's going to insert all these details, and the values are exactly what you're going to put in the JSON maps. So you're providing the JSON path for the values from the payload here. So you're saying this is how it looks like. I'm mapping the ID attribute from each element of the array, and I'm going to push it into the ID column. I'm mapping the tenant ID, pushing it into the tenant ID column, so on and so forth. So you can see I've just provided that mapping to insert into the database. Similarly, there is also an address table, and same kind of mapping I've provided. I'm saying this is how it looks like. From the address object of each element in the array, pick up the ID and map it to the ID column of the address table. Again, this just requires some quiet time to just sit and see how this works. But this is how it is going to be done. So you can look at this later. And again, all of this is available online also. But this is how you write the Persister configuration. And then when you run your module, the Persister knows exactly how to map the payload to the tables. We'll also quickly talk about the database schema. We use Flyway to manage the database migrations. Flyway is essentially just source control for your database, one way to think about it. And you can see this is how things look like. We have tables. This is standard SQL stuff, nothing special. we have created two tables, one for the registration itself and one for address. And this has exactly the same objects. I mean, the same fields that we saw in the API specification and now also in the Persister. So this is it. So when you run your application, if you have defined the flyway migrations for it, then basically it's going to create these tables for you in the database and have it ready to go. Okay, so right now I've showed you how the Persister works. Any questions on this so far?
Too many.
Too many.
I'm answering.
Okay. All right. So Ganjam is answering a lot of your queries. Anything you need to take now or?
No.
Okay. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and I'll just set up my code base to run it. Just one sec. P518. Okay. I'll start sharing this one second.
So
No. Don't think it is sufficient.
Okay, thank you so much for your patience. So we are back now. So this is my module code, right? So we've got our DB migrations ready. And this is basically the skeleton. And you can see we've got all these models, right? So if you open a birth registration application, you can see. This is what we had defined in the API spec, and this is what we are seeing here also. Okay, all these various attributes.
Vasni,
Yeah.
a few of the questions are coming from, they want to see the code
Mm.
that where we are integrating with the. When you're walking through the code, just show them that.
I will show. Sure. Yeah, we'll get into the code shortly, guys. I'm just setting it up now. So you can see that this is my controller. Typical Java Spring stuff, right? Nothing digit specific here. You've got a controller. We have defined the paths. So we've got a create API. Let me just examine this out. So this is my create API, right? So I'm posting something and there is a birth registration service which is going to register this request. So you go into this register BT request and you can see that this is what I was mentioning earlier. We are validating the application. We are enriching it, right? And I'll comment out some of this. We can come back to this later, all these integrations. So essentially what are we doing? We are validating, we are enriching, and then we are pushing some information to Kafka. Okay. So let's look at validate. What does validate do here? Again, because this is a sample module, we have kept it very simple. We are just validating whether you are sending a tenant ID. Okay. And we are saying if it is not there, then we'll throw an exception saying tenant ID is mandatory to create the birth registration application. You can add all the different validations. You can make sure that mandatory fields are present. You can check for other things also, like whether they have special characters, whether they should be, whatever other constraints you have, you can add all that. We have not added all that here because it's just a sample module and we wanted to show you this. Please make sure that your validations also correspond to your API specification. By that, I mean, in your API specification, if you have mandated 3 fields, then make sure those 3 fields are validated here. Make sure that they are going to be present. And if they are not present, then you should be throwing an exception with a proper error message so that they know what it is that they need to fix. Okay, so this is basically validation. Now going back here again, let's look at enrichment. This is what I mentioned earlier. What does enrichment mean? It basically means you are adding something extra to your payload and making it ready for consumption. That's all. So if you see here, again, I'll just get rid of this stuff for now. You can see that, we are basically creating some audit details, right? Audit details has 4 attributes: created by, created time, last modified by, and last modified time. And we are just enriching it. We are just adding it and we are setting it. And we are also going to create a UUID for each application. And we are also going to create a formatted application number for that application. What does that mean? A UUID is just a long string, right? An application number has a more readable format, and typically in all the government applications, they all want an application number. And this is something that they can define, and this we define in master data. And the ID generation service that we have will generate a unique application number for you in the format that you have specified. So let me just do this. I'll comment this out. And instead, for starters, I'll just make it a simple UUID. IdGen integration, we'll talk about it, but I'm just assigning a unique number to my application. I'm also creating an ID for it, right? And that's it. I'm basically, enriching the address, enriching audit details for address. That's it. This is what enrichment is. And this IdGen we'll come back to later. We'll do it later. So for now, all this is going to do is create a ID for your application and push it into the database when we run it. This is all there is with that. And then after that, there is only one step. We are just pushing this data to a Kafka topic. The Kafka topic is typically defined in your application.properties. We'll look at it here. It's my application.properties. So you can look at it. So we have defined certain Kafka topics here. You can see we are defining some Kafka related values, and we are also defining the Kafka topic. I just can't find it. I'm blind as a bat today, but yeah, you will find it in your application.properties, and you should also override it when you are deploying your application. You should also override it. Okay, so here we are just getting the create topic, and we are just pushing the data. And for this, there is a producer class which gets generated directly by CodeGen. You can see this here. So we have a producer class, and we've got some libraries which do the actual pushing. So you don't have to write anything. All you need to call is producer.push, pass your thing, and hopefully it will get persisted. Now let's just see this run once. So I'm going to run the persister, which I've got set up here. Okay, so I've got my persister. So I'm just running it. And I will also run my birth registration application. And one thing about the persister, when you are running your persister, make sure that your persister path is included. So the persister has to read configuration for your module, right? You have to tell your persister where to find that configuration. Otherwise, the persister will run, but it will not listen to your Kafka topic, and it will not persist the data. This is one of the FAQs typically, right? And whenever you add new configuration to the persister, you will have to restart the persister. So I'll just show you. This is the persister, right? And you can see that I have added this birth registration persister.yaml file. I have added it to the persister YAML repo path. This can be a comma separated list. So you can add many such things when you are running locally. But for now, I'm just running this one application. So I have provided the path to this configuration to the persister. Now the persister will know to listen to this particular module's Kafka topic, and it knows where to find the config. Therefore, it can persist it. Okay. So we have run the Persister. Now I'm just going to run the birth registration application also. It's going to take a few minutes to come up. Meanwhile, so you have to provide all your database values and things like that, right? Like what is the database you're going to use to connect and store the data and all that. And that's all specified in the application.properties. You can see here. Here is the Kafka topic in application properties. We've got two separate topics, one for save, create, and one for update. Okay, both of them are defined. This is typically the norm that we follow in DIGITx. And here I have defined the data source URL, username, passwords, all these things are present here. Flyway configurations and things like that.
Take like a configuration.
Sorry?
Take flyway configuration people are asking.
Flyway configuration. Okay. Flyway configuration is nothing. Flyway is basically just like I mentioned earlier, it is source control for your database. When you have an application that is running in production and you make changes to your tables and you are now going to deploy a new version of your application, right? With these changes, you have to make sure that the changes that you have made are applied properly and there is no data loss. And, basically they should be able to transition to using the new database, the new version of your tables. So that's all Flyway does. This is again nothing specific to Digit. It's standard stuff, Spring Boot stuff. There are other tools also that do this. We use Flyway. So all you have to do is Flyway also maintains certain state for migration. This is what is called as a database migration. And Flyway maintains the migration history in a schema table. So all that you have to do is just provide, the Flyway URL, which is basically again your Postgres only. Provide the same database, provide the username password for Flyway so it can connect to the database to create some of these tables. And some of these are just, additional properties for Flyway. If Flyway enabled is false, then migration will not happen. So Flyway enabled needs to be true for Flyway to run and make sure your tables are created. Like I mentioned earlier, if you are running your module for the first time, right? And you have created an empty database. When you run it for the first time, Flyway will make sure that it creates all the tables that you have defined in your DDL file. Where is the DDL file? So it's inside here, right? For each module in Digit, please define your tables inside this folder as we have shown here. And in this file, whatever SQL commands you have given, Flyway will make sure to apply it to your database. That's all. Please read up about it if you want more information about it, but that's all Flyway does. So I've run it, host is down, error connecting to node. Oh, Kafka is down, okay. Sometimes Kafka gets in a bad state. I'll have to restart Kafka. I'll do that. So looks like Kafka is up. So we'll now connect. We'll just run this again just to be safe. Hope that answered the question about Flyway. And while this service is coming up, I'll show you in PG admin. So this is the database that I'm using. I've already created it. And you can see that, there are two tables here, which we have created. Address and registration. And you can look at this also, all those. You can see that these values are already there because I was testing it out. So you've got all this information. And you've got the registration table again, and you can look at it. You can see all this information. Okay, so now we've got your module running. There are no exceptions, and you can see that the Persister is also running. me just restart the Persister since Kafka was down. It's usually not necessary, but just to be safe. And when the Persister is running, you can see, all the configurations that it is reading. You can see this message actually called loading configs that tells you whether your particular config was picked up by the Persister or not. You can see this. See, you will see a print called loading configs. And you can see the path to your Persister configuration. Many times when you feel like your data is just not getting persisted, this is where you come and look. See the Persister log. See if your Persister configuration has been picked up. If not, please restart the Persister because when you're adding new config, it has to pick it up and it does so at load time. Make sure. So now we've got the Persister running. We've got the birth registration application running. So we can actually try creating a simple application. So I'll go back to Postman. And initially, we are not going to integrate with any of the services except Persister. All we are going to do is pass some payload and hopefully it will show up in our database. If it shows up, that's good enough. So let me just authenticate and make sure token is valid for my environment. Yep, this is fine. So now I'll come here. And you can see I'm providing the token. We need to provide that. And usually when you have authenticated through some UI or something, right? All this will already be set up for you. Since we are only testing the APIs, we have to go through some of these additional steps. You can see my payload is here. I've provided, let me just provide something else. Provide something like Happy Friday. And the doctor name, you can provide something. Hospital name, Apollo, place of birth, Bangalore, and some address, type residential, whatever, AP Nagar, city, Bangalore. I'm just filling in some values. None of this is valid. And you can provide the baby's father's name. You can say, and make sure, so the father and mother, that the information you are passing along with their mobile numbers is going to enable them to log into Digit and track the status of the application. So please make sure to provide a mobile number, something unique. If the user already exists in the system, then this is going to fail. So let's say I'll just provide some random mobile number. Okay, so you can see that I've provided mobile numbers. Username, I'm just keeping it the same as the mobile number for now. You can provide more information also. I'm just providing some dummy email ID and all that. There are more fields also for the user that you can provide. That is something you can look at the user service and figure out also. I'm just providing some bare minimum fields so that we'll see this one. So now let me just check my port. What port did I start this on? Okay, 8280. So I'm going to hit localhost 8280 and I'm going to create this application. Oops. Okay, so I'm in debug mode and you can see already that we have come here. Basically, we came here to register a request and then it came in here. It would have validated the application. All the values are valid. If something was wrong, then we would have thrown an exception. We have also enriched the application. And now all we are going to do is push this payload to the Kafka topic. Okay, so I'm just going to let it run. Okay, now it has gone ahead. And if you look in the Persister configuration, you will see that, it has persisted this. You will see some prints. See, persisted 1 rows to the DB. And you can see the query that got executed, insert into address, blah, blah, etc. Right? So we have persisted this successfully. So this is a major step. Now you've got your Persister running, you are able to push data to the database. Now let's just look at this database table to make sure this made it in here. You can see this. So we just now created this, right? Happy Friday is the name that I gave, and all the doctor's name, hospital name, etc. is here. Now the parents' ID, this father ID and mother ID is nothing but the UUID of the user which will be created for the parents. That is null because I have not done any integrations with the user service yet. So these values are not getting filled in. I'll show you shortly how that will be done, and then you'll see the UUIDs getting populated here. And if you see here, you can see that a unique UUID has been generated for this application. And the application number is also a UUID because that's what we consciously decided. But in many cases, they want some kind of format like this, right? Whatever it is for that particular ULB. So you should be able to define it and generate a unique ID based on that format. So that's what we will look at next. We are going to look at how to integrate with IdGen. Okay. IdGen just stands for ID generation service. This service basically gives you unique IDs given some format. So we look at how we can do that. Okay. So for IdGen in MDMS, in the MDMS repository under common masters, you can define the format that you need. So I'll show you how that has been done. Okay, so I'm just opening up my MDMS repository locally. Okay, and you can see, a lot of things. So tenant definition is there in MDMS. You've got access control definition. You've got city level tenants and information there. All these things will be there. Now, if you look under common masters, this folder, there is a file called idformat.json. Okay. In this idformat.json, you can already see that many modules have defined the IDs required for their particular module. So you can see a lot of stuff here. So I have added a new entry like this. This format is nothing special to eGov. It depends on your customer or your partner who has defined a certain format. Governments typically have, for files, they want a certain format. So that's what this allows you to do. You can see that I've provided some PB BTR, and I've provided a year and also a sequence number. Okay. And this ID format, I've given a unique ID name. Make sure you do that. And this is how you will go retrieve for your module. You are going to say, give me the format for my module. You will request it from the IdGen service. And then IdGen will go ahead and create a unique number for you and return it to you. Okay. Once this has been defined, make sure you restart MDMS service. Anytime you add anything new to MDMS, please make sure you restart the MDMS service. Otherwise, it will not pick up the change. Okay. So this has been defined for me, and I've already pushed it in my environment also. I'll show you where it is. So what I showed you was local. I'll also show you where I have pushed it in the repository. So you can see. So this is my MDMS repository. So inside PG, inside common masters, in ID format, I have defined this. This means in my environment, I have defined it. My MDMS service has been restarted. So it will pick up this config. It knows if I pass this ID name, it knows where to go and retrieve it from. Okay. So now let's go back to the code. And in the code, in enrich birth application, I commented this line out, right? And this is your integration with the IdGen service. If you see here, what am I saying? I'm saying there is a utility class called IdGen util. Okay, in here, I'm basically calling it. I'm saying, give me a list of IDs. I'm passing some request info object. I'm passing the tenant name, and I'm passing the ID of that thing that we just defined. And I'm saying, give me only one ID. I only need one. You can specify 10, you can specify 15 or 5 or whatever you want. For now, I only need one. So I'm saying, give me one ID. Okay. Now, if you look at this IdGen util class, This is where it actually makes the call to the IdGen service. Again, this is nothing special to Digit, right? This is standard Spring Boot communication with other REST services. We use REST templates. So you can see that we are generating a request, right? We are passing the payload and we are sending the request info and we are just saying build and then we are calling it. That's all. We are saying REST repository, fetch the result, and we are passing the URI and the response. Now, where does your application know, what is the host name for IdGen? This is again defined in your application.properties file. So if you go here, you can see that we define all the integrations, all the host names, eGov.mdms.host. So I've defined my MDMS host here. I've defined my user host here. I've defined my IdGen host here. I've said, please hit this server. This is the path. The path usually remains the same. The host can change depending on your environment and if you're port forwarding it and all that. So you can specify what is the server name for IdGen, where it needs to go. So this has been defined already. So now if I go back here, so I'm retrieving a list of IDs, in my case, only one ID. This I need to make sure and set it as the application number. So the code for this is already here. I'm just going to comment this out. So you can see that I'm getting the first element from that array list and setting it as the application number. Now, when we run this, what can we see? We'll see that an application gets persisted to the database and we'll see that a unique number has been assigned to it. Okay, so I'll just restart this service. And I'll meanwhile configure my payload. I'll just make this like happy 2, Friday 2, party 2, follow 2. That's it. Right? So we'll see that this entry gets created and we'll properly get a ID from IdGen. Okay, so the service is up, still coming up. Okay, now I'll go ahead again and create the birth application. Oops, need to remove that breakpoint. But now you can see it here. See that a new ID has been created in the format that you specified and it has been assigned. You can see 0032. Now, if we go to the database and just see it, you can see it here. So this is what we saw. Notice the difference. Earlier, this was just a UUID we were generating, and now you have a proper formatted ID. And this is what usually gets shown in all the UI places and everywhere, so that citizens can track their services. So now this is done. So this is getting persisted. So we have successfully completed integration with one digit service. Any questions so far?
There's some questions on Persister. As to, does Persister have any threshold value and what is the retention period and rotation policy? Gansham is addressing.
Okay.
Any polls in between?
Right now I don't have any.
Okay.
You think we can ask something?
Not getting any question related to
IdGen, is it?
this current thing, what your people are still in Persister world.
Okay. Can you please briefly cover one service end-to-end at code level, mainly Spring Boot structure level? Okay. I think that's what we just covered.
Long back.
Yeah, okay. How can we create master data from scratch? This is actually a big topic in itself.
It's a different.
And our implementation team, Elsa and Pradeep and co are experts at this. We'll address it. Please post whatever questions you have in the discussion board. Maybe we would give them the discussion board link. No?
This was posted in the group,
Okay.
in the chat.
So please post it there. Some of this requires sessions on their own, and we will extend this bootcamp series to include this also from implementation. Okay, so Persister, please go read about it also. Some of this will sound very complicated now, but if you go and read about it, then it becomes simpler. There is only so much we can cover in 3 hours. So we are limited by that. Okay, so now successfully we have completed one integration, which is with IdGen, and that was fairly super simple. Okay. Next, yeah.
There is one thing, can you explain setting or starting path for IdGen or other service?
Setting our starting path means
I think the context path is, I don't know, just see the last
okay.
Q&A, the last one.
So typically when you have all these services, whoever is asking the question, or who is it?
Bikash.
Okay, because typically, when you have deployed this service, the API specs are well documented for all these core platform services. Okay, and that is all documented. Like I'll show you where it is just for reference. And all these paths are set. Only the host name you need to set according to your environment. If you have deployed Digit in your environment, then you need to change the host name. The path will not change. So for example, if you go to platform, you go to core services, there is also API specifications. You can see for IdGen, for the IdGen. You can see the API specification, how it looks like, what needs to be passed, right? So all this is information that is already documented. See, ID requests, it's an array. You have to pass an ID name and a tenant ID. This ID name is what we specified. And this is the tenant ID. So this is all you need to pass to this particular service. And you can go read about these services also. This is just API specifications. You can look at core services. You can go down and there is IdGen here. Now, you can go read about how this service works. What is the key functionality? How all this is. In the code, if you are asking where do I go set the path, this is where you set. In application.properties, you can define one specific key. Again, this is something that you define only. This is what we have defined and we follow this convention, but you can define whatever you want, right? You can call it my idgen.host, my idgen.path. This path will remain constant. Only your host name will differ. Okay, so that is IdGen. Next, we'll look at integrating with the user service. This is fairly a big integration and also one of the most common things also. So we'll again look at the birth registration service, right? Basically from the controller, the request will come into this service. And here, we are just going to say user service.call user service. Now let's go look in here. So if you see, what does call user service do? Right? It basically picks up the birth registration application. It is going to check if this mother and father users, are they already present in the user registry? If they are already present, then all we will do is pick up their UUID and enrich it in the application. We'll enrich their details. If this user is not present, then we are going to create this user in the user registry so that they can log in. If they are already present, they know how to log in also. So that's all we are going to do. So if you check here, we are going to basically create this user. That is, creation is nothing but creating this user object. And you can see this here. So basically what I'm trying to do is build a user object. Again, standard Spring Boot stuff. I'm using a builder. I'm setting some user name, mobile number, email ID, tenant ID, type, roles, etc. And I'm just going to upsert this user. All these fields, whatever you are seeing here, is stuff that I'm getting from the request. If you look at the father applicant or mother, you can see these fields are stuff that I'm passing. I'm just constructing this user object, and then I'm going to call upsert user. And what does this upsert do? It's basically just going to, search for the user. If this user already exists, then we will not create the user. We are just going to return that existing user. The search will be based on the mobile number. We find the user, we'll return. If not, we will create that user. And if you look at this create user call, all it is doing is constructing the URI. Then it will create a user request object. And it is going to just call the user service. So if you look at it here, you can see. I'm going to basically call the user service with the URI and the payload, and I will get some responses. and I'm going to return the response. So that's all will happen. So if I go back here, so enrichment, what it will do in this case is it will call the user service, fetch all these details and enrich the details and send it back. So fairly straightforward stuff. The secret sauce in how you are integrating with the user service, understanding how to post the payload and all those things, right? And that is what we have tried to demonstrate here. Again, I can't go into very great detail just because of time constraints, but you can see there is a create user request where you are passing request info and an user object. And this is a user POJO where we have certain things. One thing about the user service, we are in the process of redesigning it and enhancing it. So there are, that will come out shortly. And, there are certain enhancements which will also detail when it comes out. But yeah, there are certain bug fixes we are trying to make to this service and make it more simple to use. So that is in works. But for now, this is what we are using across all our missions. So you can see this is the POJO, and basically you just need to call the user service from user util. This is the main place where we are fetching a result, and we are also converting the payload that we are getting as the response using Jackson converters. Using an object mapper, we are just saying convert it into this format, which is called user detailed response. So if you look here, this is just, it's going to contain a response information object and a list of users. So we fetch the result, we convert it into this format and return it. So that's pretty much all we are doing in this user service integration. Once this integration happens in the database, where earlier you were seeing empty UUIDs for the father and mother users, now you will see proper UUIDs like this. This means they are actually users who have been created in the user registry. So let's try it out. Again, the same payload should be fine. I'll just change some information so we know for quick identification. We'll do this and create something like this. I'm just making sure to pass a new mobile number so that we'll see the creation happen. Okay. So now we'll send. Oops. Oh, user service is not port forwarded. So again, this is a common problem, right? Like where you suddenly see some exception. The reason is this. If you notice the user host, I have port forwarded it locally. Okay. And that was not running, and therefore I'm getting this exception. You can use port forwarding to bypass some of these authentication and access control problems. So that's why I did it. So let's go back here. Let's just make sure I'm port forwarding it again. I'm getting the pods in my cube cluster. I'll find my user pod. This is my user pod. And now I'll just port forward it. Oh, it's already there. Okay. Is it the same pod? Yeah. So I'm port forwarding it from 8080 to 8289, and I'm providing the namespace as eGov. So now you'll see it's getting port forwarded. Now, basically, my module will be able to pick up and send requests to this host name, and it will work. So this is the error we saw earlier. This should hopefully not happen. There you go. So it has created. We got a 200 okay, which means it created fine. And you can now see that in the response, you are seeing this ID getting generated for the father applicant and the mother applicant. This means you have created the user. In the user registry, you have successfully integrated with the user service. We can also double check that in our database again. And the way you can verify it, you can pass that user ID to the user search APIs, and you can retrieve the object. So you can see this. This is what we just created, and these are the IDs. Okay. I don't have that curl with me right now, but you can find those curls. The APIs online. How do you search for a user? All those Postman collections are also available. If you search for that user with this ID, then you'll be able to find. But so now we have completed 2 integrations. We have now successfully integrated with the IdGen service and also the user service. One thing I wanted to show, okay, so how does this work, right? So if you see here, the user service, this is the authentication and authorization flow diagram, okay? You've got the API gateway, which is Zool. You've got the user service, you've got the access control service, then MDMS, and whatever your, in this case, the last box here on the right-hand side is your birth registration module. So you can see that initially when a request comes in to Zool, it is going to send it to the user. The auth filter will kick in, it will send it to the user service. User service will validate whether this is a proper user and all that, and it will send back a response to Zool. Now, if the authentication succeeded and the API is not whitelisted, then Zool is going to check authorization. So now it is going to send the request to the access control service. The access control service will basically read all your roles and actions and role action mappings from MDMS, right? And it is going to verify whether this particular user, this particular role has access to the resource they are requesting. And this will send back a response to Zool, whether it is 401 or 200. 401 is HTTP code unauthorized. That means this user doesn't have access to that resource. 200 is it works. If the request is authorized, now Zool will forward the request to that particular service. So this is how the auth and auth flow works. So whenever you have Zool in the mix, if you port forward, you are bypassing Zool from your kube cluster. But if you are actually hitting the host name without port forwarding, then you will have to go through Zool. Any questions you have to address?
Yes. One question somebody is asking, can you describe how workflow and its source code works? You went through part of it, but not
Workflow I have not yet gotten into.
not your
We
client.
not go through the source code, but I'll show how the integration works. I can show where the workflow source code is, and maybe they can have a look at it. Okay, so this is it for the user integration. So the next thing that I want to discuss a little bit is MDMS. MDMS is basically Master Data Management Service. And this is one of the most frequently used services in Digit. You will make umpteen calls to it. But fairly at its heart, it's a very simple service. It basically is responsible for retrieving some configuration that you have put in. That's all. The configuration itself, the master data config itself, resides in GitHub. It is not stored in a database currently. So all this service will do is figure out what to retrieve, from where to retrieve, and it will retrieve that data. And this is one of the most frequently used services in Digit, and it's very important we understand this. If you are an enterprise architect or an enterprise developer, you know that term master data. This is a very common enterprise architecture term. Every module has certain master data. In the world of Digit, this master data is something that does not change very frequently. It is fairly constant. Maybe it changes once a year, maybe once in 5 years. Things like boundary hierarchy, right? Your ward, district, ward, locality mapping, things like that. These don't change very often. Your electoral boundaries, so many other things don't change often, right? So this is what we call as master data. And in Digit, very early on, a design decision was made to keep this master data as JSON configuration in GitHub instead of putting it in the database. We'll look at why that was done. So this was a very conscious decision that was made. So basically there are APIs, right? And you've got your application requires some master data. And if you put all this master data in the database, then you have to keep writing different APIs to support CRUD operations on that master data. Now, if these APIs are going to be used only once a year or once in 5 years, then it's a waste of time trying to write so many APIs and also maintaining it and understanding it. So that is why in Digit, transactional data resides in the database. This is data that is live and fast changing. Slow changing data, which is one-time setup data, was basically moved to GitHub. And the MDMS service essentially just fronts this GitHub. It reads the data from there and it serves it to you. We'll look into how actually I'll show you one master just to explain how it looks like. But that's pretty much it. That is the MDMS service. And this is why this was done. Ghanshyam, you want to add anything about
I think I explained that in already architecture section.
Ghanshyam had already walked through MDMS design and all this in his session. So if there are other questions, we'll just please post it in the discussion board and we'll take it up later. So what is an MDMS? Basically, you will have many things. A few things related to this module are you will have roles. What are roles? Basically, actors who will work with your service, right? In this case, verifier, approver, citizen, employee, etc. These roles have to be defined upfront in MDMS. There are some actions. What are actions? These are just APIs. We call them as actions. What are the APIs that your module is exposing? Each API is mapped to a particular ID. And we have role action mappings. This is our access control config, right? Basically, which role has access to which API. And this is what the access control service looks at and decides whether to return a 401 or a 200 to Zoom. So that's it. So we define these three things in MDMS. In the case of this particular module, there is not much of master data that we need to define. We have just defined a sample thing called birth registration charges. Basically, when you are applying for this, how much you have to pay for it to download the certificate. Again, it's not a very real use case. In the real world, if, for example, the property tax module, it will have multiple masters. It will have complicated masters also. So understanding how to define master data for a module is very important. We'll just walk through a few things that are relevant to this module, but this is a topic in itself. Think through your masters before development begins, because once you have developed something, then changing it becomes difficult. So make sure you do that. I'll show you how the masters look like. So this is my master data repository. So for the developer tutorial, this is the master that I have defined. This is again not a very complicated master. So when defining master data, there are two aspects to it. When you are searching in MDMS, right? How do you search for data? You have to provide a module name and a master name. The module name is what you have defined here. The master name is this. A single module can have multiple masters, right? So I can have something like, I can keep adding more things. Under registration charges, maybe I will add one more thing, whatever I want to add. And you can also define a separate master also. Master 2, and you can put something here also. So you can keep adding stuff. For now, I have just defined a single master. I'll also show you a different master which has more data. But this is it. Once you have defined your master, you'll have to check it in and make sure MDMS is restarted so it can pick it up. If we look at some of these other masters, for example, roles, you can see that the module name for this is this. And this is the master name called roles. And typically we try to keep the module name and the folder name the same, just so that it's easier for us to visually find out where our configuration is. But the folder name can be anything else. But make sure, I mean, this is just a convention we are following to make things easy to find. But module name and master name are very important. You can see that we have defined certain roles: citizen, system, employee, etc., right? Similarly, if you look at actions, you can see that the module name is this and the master name is actions -test. So now if you look for the birth registration module, I have defined it here. So I have added all my APIs here. You can see the URL, I've given it a particular ID. I have given it some information service code, etc. But the important thing is the ID should be unique. Typically, we just go to the end of the file, we pick the last ID and increment it by 1, and we just add it here. The URL is important. So I have defined 3 URLs, 122, 123, 124 for my 3 APIs, create, update, and search. You need the actions and the role action mapping when you are actually deploying your service into your environment. It is not required when you are running it locally. This is only needed when you are going through Zoom and your Kubernetes cluster, when it's accessed through Zoom. So for running locally, this doesn't matter. I've just defined it so I can show you. If we get to the deployment phase, then I can show you how this works. But this is done. And there is also role action mapping. In the role action mapping, we are basically going to say which role has access to which resource. So I'm basically, for the 3 APIs, I'm providing access to both citizen and employee. You can see citizen, employee map to all these 3 APIs. Excuse me. So that's it. So this is also in the master data repository in GitHub. Make sure your ID, the action ID, should match the whatever you defined in the actions master. This ID needs to match. Otherwise, this is not going to work. So for each role that you want to provide access to an API, you'll have to provide a separate entry. And once again this is done, you should restart access control service and MDMS service as well, so that it will pick it up. So these are some of the sample masters. You can also look at some of the complicated ones that we are building. A lot of this is available already on the eGov MDMS data repository. One thing to think about when you are defining masters is, if you have hierarchical masters, then consider using namespaced ones. Like if you have type dot subtype, then you can, define your master name as type dot subtype, and then you can provide certain attributes to it. This is again something advanced. When you get into that sort of complicated masters, you can look at it. You can look at the property service masters for examples of this, how it has been done. But yeah, be very, very careful when you are defining masters. How you define it will have an impact on how easy your application becomes. One more thing to consider while you are integrating with this MDMS services, when you are fetching master data for your module, if there are multiple masters, right? Fetch everything in one go. Don't keep making repeated calls. Fetch everything in one go, and you can use JSON path to filter out what you need in your code base. This is just to be more efficient and avoid multiple network calls. This is a common problem that I've seen where we keep making repeated requests, and that's unnecessary. So anything else I need to cover with master data, Ghanshyam? Already too much. Okay, so the CodeGen tool also creates, all these utility files, right, to integrate with MDMS. You can see that this has been, utility was created, and we just wrote one extra wrapper to fetch this registration charge amount. Okay, so I'll show you from Postman. We can search MDMS for, this is the master we had defined, right? For the module BTR, this is the master I just showed you. So if you do a MDMS search, you are able to retrieve it. So this is there. And basically the same thing we have done in code also, where we have integrated with the MDMS service to fetch this master so that we can use it in some places. So this is that. And lastly, I think we'll come to workflow. So we'll talk a little bit about workflow, and then we'll get into the code.
1 second, somebody is asking, can you repeat the last statement? What we need to avoid?
What we need, multiple network calls to the MDMS service. If you've got, multiple masters, right? For some modules, you will have a lot of different masters that you are going to read from. If you keep making repeated calls across the network, inter-service calls only, but still you can avoid it. You can fetch all your master data in one go, and then you can just filter out whatever you need instead of each time going and making a call. That's just a best practice that we try to follow in some of our the modules that we built. So that's something that you should keep in mind. Okay, so integrating with workflow. Typically, I have found that this is where a lot of difficulties happen. Maybe because I'm not sure why, but it's actually a fairly straightforward thing, and hopefully we'll simplify it for you here. So this is the diagram I showed you earlier, right? This is where we derived our workflow config also from. This is workflow. Workflow is just a series of states that happen as your application goes through its particular life cycle. And I also showed you the configuration that we did for workflow. We did all this. Now, when you are integrating with workflow, what do we need to do? We have to first configure the workflow. This is already done. When you configure workflow for a module, this is like the master template or the class definition in Java terms. Each application in your module will have an instance of workflow, which is going to be associated with it. We call it the process instance module. There is a process instance class in the Digit libraries, right? So each time you create an application, an instance of this workflow gets tagged to your application, and it's identified by your unique application number. Okay. This process instance will basically move through the life cycle of various states and all that stuff. And when to transition the state is something that we take care of in the module itself. And it comes in as an update request through Postman. Basically, you should also pass in an update request and say, okay, update my workflow also. This is the action I'm doing. And these are the comments and these are the documents I want to attach to this particular action. When you do that, workflow will basically move to the correct state, and it will also attach all this extra information that you've added to it, right? And that way, when in the UI you see it, you will see a timeline of your application, how it has moved from X to Y to Z, and you will see all the details also. So now let's try this integration. I'll show you the code. Let's start with the request. So if we want to create an application with the workflow, right? How does it look like, the payload? So this is what it looks like. You will add a workflow attribute to your JSON. You're going to say initially when you're creating a birth application, the action is apply. There are some comments you can add, and there are some documents you can attach as part of your workflow, right? At each step, you can add some things. So I've just added some dummy document, and I've just added something like applying for birth registration. You can also assign the workflow to a specific user. That is something we'll discuss later. I think it will be too much right now. But basically, this is how it looks like. Okay. Now, if you look at code, all we are doing is we are going to, each time a register request comes in, we are also going to initiate workflow for that particular application. So what are we doing here? We are getting the application and we are going to get the process instance for that application. This is what I mentioned, right? Workflow is your class, process instance is your object. Each application is tagged to a process instance. Now, if you look at this code, fairly straightforward. I'm getting the workflow object from the application, and I'm basically retrieving certain attributes from the application and searching for this process instance. I'm going to try and find it if it already exists. If not, I'm going to create a new one and just move it through the states. So if you notice my workflow, this is the business and this is the business service, and that is something we should set in the code, the module name and the business service name. This should ideally be in configuration, and you should just read from there. And you won't keep changing this very often also. I'm just doing it because I'm teaching something and I need to keep changing it. So basically you are getting a process instance. You are specifying the module name, you are specifying the tenant ID, the business service, all this stuff, right? And you are constructing this process instance object. And you are retrieving it. Okay. You have done it. Now, if you have constructed the process instance object, now you are going to make a request. You are creating a process instance request which contains this and you are going to call workflow. In workflow, again, same concept. You are fetching the workflow host, you are building the URL, and then you are passing the payload to it and saying, okay, now give me the results. And if a process instance object will be created for you for this application and will return it to you. So this is all there is in the workflow service. Again, a lot of this code is automatically generated as part of CodeGen. There may be minor tweaks that have been made to it, but most of it is done. So once we get the process instance object, in my application, I'm going to set the workflow status from the workflow object. I'm going to set it here based on that. Any questions on workflow so far? Okay, I'll show you how we are doing this with workflow and then maybe we'll take this. So basically, so far we have not been passing any workflow, right? And now we'll pass workflow. I'm going to create something like adding some random names here. Okay. And now I'm going to create this. My workflow, I'll just double check to make sure it's port forwarded. That's fine. Okay, so I got a 200 OK response. And now if you see my workflow status, you are seeing this. Applied workflow status has moved to applied. And my current status is in workflow. Basically, this application, we have applied for it and I'm in workflow. So if you look at the earlier one that we did, when we created something without workflow, you can see all this was null. And now when we are creating with workflow, you are seeing that workflow status has transitioned. Workflow, I am not running it locally, but I highly recommend that you run the workflow service locally just to understand how it breaks it down into tables and where it stores all the information, all the actions and states and things like that. Because that will make it easier for you to understand how the workflow transition happens. So this is pretty much it for workflow. Now we have integrated with the workflow service also. I can show you some of this if we have time later. But basically now workflow is done. So you know what the status of your application is. Let's try to update this application. Maybe we'll just update the workflow status. So for update, I'll just pick this. I'll take the same create payload only. I'll just modify a little bit for update. So this is my update thing. So all I'm going to do is I will change this to be one of those what we just created. Okay. And we will also now update. So here I will make it approve. So this is basically when ULB employee will approve it. We can also try changing the names. Okay. So this is update. And for update, remember that in this case, you should pass an ID because while creating, you don't have an ID. Whereas while updating, you do need to have an ID. So back here. And I will pick up the ID. If you don't pass an ID, the update will fail. So you should pass an ID. So here I'll go back here and I will make sure this ID is present. Okay. So now I'm going to call the update API. I'm changing the baby's first name alone. And if you remember the Persister configuration we discussed, again, what you choose to update is up to you in your configuration. In our case, we have kept it very simple. If you see here in the update, I'm only updating these three things. I'm only allowing update of these three things. If you want to update more fields, you can add more fields to the update configuration. And if you see the update, this is going to pick up from a different topic. Update BT application, and it's going to execute this. Okay. So now if I do the update, we should basically see this change, right, to Rama 3, because that's what I've changed it to. And this is the ID I'm updating. FF, whatever it is. So this is what should get updated, and the workflow status should change. So where the workflow status is something else right now, it should move. So that needs to happen. So we'll do it now. Let's do update. Oops. An exception. Oh, audit details. Okay. The payload audit details also needs to be there. A lot of this is because typically when you are doing it through the UI or some other interface, a lot of this will already be there for you. This is nothing, we are trying to mock a lot of things through this, and that is why it feels like we are doing a lot of extra steps. But with API testing, that is always true, because you're trying to mock something the UI is doing. So what I did was I just copied the payload from create, the response payload from create. And now here you will have all these audit details and things like that, which were set during update. So now I will just change this to approve. Okay, null pointer exception. I need to see what's going on. So it's failing here. Get ID. Why? What's ID now?
IdGen it is not getting.
Oh, IdGen port. No. Update. Validate the application update request. Get ID. Is it not having an ID? Okay, birth registration application. Ah, okay. This is the problem with the payload. I had an extra S. Okay. Ah, now it worked. Basically, it was a payload problem. But I had an extra S at the end, and that is why it failed. So now if you see, you've got a response. You can see that the update has happened, right? Workflow status has changed to approved. So we passed workflow action as approved. Now it has changed to approved. So the update has worked. So that's pretty much for update. Again, it's most of it comes down to just most of the code for update and create are the same. I'll just show you how the code looks also. So again, we start with the controller. You can see the update. The controller calls into the birth registration service update application. And you can see that it needs to validate. And we saw a couple of errors now where the validation failed, right? If I don't have an ID for a particular entity, then you can't update it. It doesn't even exist. So you saw that it threw an error. So that's basically, this is how you debug. You say that, okay, you check your payload, you see that there is no ID, therefore it failed. So that was one of the errors that we saw. And I mean, that's it. You validate it, and once it's validated, then you again enrich it. It's again the same thing as create, except maybe some changes, right? Because you already expect audit details to be there. So you will just modify the existing audit details instead of creating a new object. Whereas during create, you will create it new. Here you will just modify it. And if that is not there, again, it will throw an error like we saw. And finally, we are just updating the workflow status. We are calling the workflow service and we are moving. We are saying apply this action on this workflow, and that will just move it to the next state. And we are getting the response back from it, and we are setting it in our application. So we know what is the status of our application. And that is what we saw here. Basically, this is workflow has now moved to approved state. And that is what we are fetching and storing in our database also. So that's it for update. And then we also have search. So we can search for this application, for example. You can see that the search API works fine. You're able to retrieve it and you're able to see all the data that is there. This means sometimes what happens is during the update call, you will update workflow. Okay. And it looks like the call succeeded because all this is asynchronous. And you will also get a response payload. But when you search for the application, you will not find the workflow or you will not find the data that you need. This is a classic microservices issue with async flows. So always make sure that you cannot assume that just because you got a response back from your API, that the data actually made it to the database. Most of the times it will, 99% it will. But if there are some issues with Kafka or if there are some other issues with the Persister, something goes down, then your API basically has said, okay, I have now pushed the data to be sent to the data store, and it will send you a 200 OK response in the expectation that it will complete. When it doesn't, if you do a search and you don't find it, then you know there is a problem either in your queue or in your Persister, and you need to debug and see what happens. We've got a lot of the error queue handling and things like that coming up in the platform as part of the core platform features. And that is something we'll soon roll out. But this may happen even when you have deployed your service, everything is working fine. This may still happen. Very common FAQ for us from all our partners and other developers. So make sure your search actually returns the results. Only then you can be sure that the data made it to the database. Okay. So far we have seen create, update, search. We've also integrated with 4 different services now. Workflow, user, IdGen, and MDMS. Okay. I think I'm going to park this for a while because I think already we've got a lot of stuff. We can just talk about it for a little bit, how to deploy. Again, Aniket's session, hopefully for those of you who attended Aniket's session, this may make sense. I think we should pick this up maybe later on. One thing I do want to point out is on our core.digit.org website, we've got a developer guide. Okay? Here, we've got a backend developer guide, which exactly goes through the steps that we just talked about. In addition, we have also tried to make it simple where we have created it in stages. Creating a project is one section. Integrating Persister and Kafka is another section. So we have tried to break it down, right? And for each stage, we have put up a Postman collection and the code with the commit ID so that at each stage you can pull it down, try it out and see and feel more confident about each of these integrations. So we highly recommend that you actually go through this. Exactly what was discussed here is what is there also, but in greater detail, because this is something you have to read and do. How to add Persister configuration, all this has been given. So please go through this and try out a Digit service. We are also doing certifications on Digit, which means that if you go through this developer guide and you complete an assignment and you mail it in to us, we will review it and we will certify you on Digit. This is something Vibhor can speak more about later on. But if you do this, you will get a certificate from us. And this will definitely help you in understanding how to write a digit module, how to build it. Okay. There is also a video course link. The same thing that we have put up in this tutorial is also available as a video course. And that is on YouTube on the e-government's channel. Again, Vibhor can speak more to it. But if you go there, you will, I'll be walking you through exactly what we did here, but in greater detail, because it's a video. I'm actually doing live coding also. So you'll be able to see that. So these two resources in addition to this webinar is what is going to help you. So I'll pause here now and open it up for questions. Before, if you want to add a note about digit certifications, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Subhashini. So on the digit certification, there are two things that you could look at. One, I'll just post a link in the chat about a basic developers course that Subhashini has recently developed and is available on YouTube. At the end of this video course, there is an assignment. If you complete that, you can submit that assignment as instructed in the video. And I mean, after the assessment, we'll issue the certificate. The second part is we're soon going to launch a Digit Academy, which will be collection of courses on Digit. This is upcoming, and you will hear it in a few weeks from us about it, where there would be not just this developer course, but also other courses about designing a digit service, architecting a digit service, installing digit, building on digit, extension of digit, etc. would be put forth. There could be some course on product specifics, application specifics, or digit at core. So these are two things about it. I see few of the participants have their hand raised. If I have any query, I would request them to post it in the Q&A channel, or if they want to have a comment to make or any conversation to participate, please use the chat window. Anything specific that you could talk about, we'll see how can we allow you to speak in this session, and then Subha can respond to your queries. We'll take a couple of minutes break. Subha is just joining us back. Thank you.
What's our YouTube link?
I'll just share in the chat.
Somebody's asked.
I just talked about the course.
Okay.
Continue.
Okay. Let me stop sharing my screen. So basically, I think we'll stop here to deploy the module in an environment, right? Basically, you've tested your module now. To deploy it, you'll have to write some Helm charts for your module and deploy it. So I can show you how to write the Helm chart, but I think that might be too much information at the moment, but I'll anyway show you how do you do it. So this is something that Aniket covered as part of his course also. So in the Digit DevOps repository, there is a deploy as code section. There is Helm and there are charts, right? Under Helm charts, basically we try to follow the same structure that we have followed in the code base also. So if you have created a module under core services, right, in your Digit OSS repository, then we try to put all the config also in the same folder structure, so it's easy to find. So if you see here, tutorials, backend developer guide, BTR services, right? This is where it lives. The same folder path is where it lives in the code base. So same thing we have done. And what we typically do is you can just copy paste one of the other charts and you can just modify some of it. So if you go here, you can modify. See, I've just changed. Application is BTR services. Ingress is true. some of this you need to understand how Kubernetes works, how Helm works, what is ingress. All these things will help you to debug and deploy your service more easily. You can find all of this information on YouTube, right? What is ingress? What is an init container? All this stuff. So basically you copy paste and you just change a few things. Provide like the image name, the DB image name, what is the liveness probe path, readiness probe path. The important thing is all the environment variables that you need your service to define needs to go here. What are these environment variables? Basically, whatever you have defined in your application.properties has to be overridden here for your environment. So again, this goes to what Aniket was discussing, but I'll just show you. There are typically 3 levels in deploying a service. One is your application.properties, whatever you have defined there, that is what your service will read from. The second level is you will have these environment variables defined in the Helm chart, which will override your application properties. The third level is you also have a Helm environment file itself. Like for instance, we have something like this, where you are defining your, DB host and name and all your service configurations. Your service hosts get defined here, right? And this is what you will put in your environment variable. Now, if I go back here in values, right, you can see that eGov IdGen host. So in my application.properties, if I go, this is my property name, eGov.idgen.host. When you are defining the environment variable, convert all your dots into underscores for your variables. So now eGov_idgen_host. Now I'm saying get the value from the cluster config, get it from eGov service host is the name, and the key is eGov IdGen. Now, if you look at this in, let's say here, eGov service host, right? If you look for IdGen here, you can see that the host name is defined, right? So this is the host name it is going to pick up and use to integrate with IdGen. When you have deployed your service in the Kubernetes cluster, it will essentially become an inter-service call within the cluster. So it is just going to invoke this host and pass the request and do it. If you provide the fully qualified host name, right, in your application.properties, and you forget to override it, then it stops becoming an inter-service call. It will be like accessing it from outside the Kubernetes cluster, and that will lead to a lot of problems. So typically, if you have any host name issues, check your Helm chart. Make sure you have overridden the correct things in your Helm chart. And that will take care of most of the issues that people face when deploying a service. So if you look here, for my service, I have just overridden all these things: workflow host, MDMS host, user host, whatever I have defined in application.properties, I have overridden in the deployment environment. Now, this is the Helm chart. And if you have CI/CD setup, then you can basically build your module and deploy it. To build your module, first of all, you have to create a pipeline for your module in Jenkins. By that, I mean, going back to the code again. So for example, let's say I'm here. This is my code base, okay? There is a build folder in Digit. This is again something that Aniket may cover in great detail about how to do CI/CD setup and all that, but we'll briefly touch on it. So if you look at it here in the build config.yaml, this is where you define how all your services get built. So if you see here, I go to BTR services. So you can see that I'm giving a name, I'm giving a working directory for this service. This is the path to that service. I'm providing the image name, the Docker file location, all this stuff. When I do this, if I define this in the build config YAML, I have to define it in the master branch first, and also in the branch where you are working, your feature branch. Once I do this in Jenkins, you can run the job builder. I'll show you. If you've got Jenkins set up, which I don't know if many of you have it set up, But basically, if you've got CI/CD set up, then go into builds. You can do, for example, I'll just pick something. You can basically do a job builder. Where is the job builder? Job builder. Basically this. You can run this job builder and this will basically read all the configuration from the build config YAML file from the master branch of your repository, and it will build a pipeline. By that I mean, eventually it will show up here somewhere. Okay. So for example, for this service, DIGITdev, let's say this. So you can see that this module pipeline has been created. This was done a long time ago. Therefore, you are seeing all these failures and things like that. But pipeline for this module has been created. Now, basically, if you want to build this, you will just go build with parameters and it will build your module. And you will get a Docker image ID. And this Docker image ID, you can take and deploy in your environment, either using Helm or you can use Jenkins, whatever you want to use. So that's how the whole, building and deployment process works for a module. Define your Helm charts, modify the build config YAML in the master branch as well as your feature branch, run the job builder, get the pipeline set, and then start building and deploying. Again, a lot of this might just sound like Greek and Latin to many of you. If you have not installed Digit, if you have not set up CI/CD, then it will sound pretty overwhelming. But my suggestion is don't get overwhelmed. All this is like a step-by-step process that you will figure out eventually. First thing to do is to just get started building on Digit, and slowly you will see things come together. And please do attend some of the upcoming sessions also on Digit. We are also going to talk about how to build a UI on top of this backend that we have just built. So all these things will also be taken care of in the upcoming sessions. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Before we can open it up for Q&A.
Yeah.
A question, please explain the cloning the code in local one more time.
Okay.
Is there a documentation? Then I
mean, yeah, we can, cloning is nothing, it's just a Git clone. So sorry if that sounded very archaic, but basically you go to GitHub, right? And Digit OSS is our code base, the public repository. If you click on code, you can see that you can clone it using this URL. So you will just take it, copy this, and you will clone it locally. If you are familiar with Git. So now if I want to clone it, I'll just do Git clone and I will provide this.
Not
So
sure
it's just
whether they meant port forwarding or not, but it's mentioned as cloning. Cloning is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so you'll just pull that into your repository. Can we let them talk, Vibhor?
Yeah. So, what do you want to reply to?
Gaurav Tyagi has asked.
Yes, his hand is raised.
He has his hand raised.
Yeah, Gaurav, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Is it like, are we able to hear Vibhor? Is the setup?
We should be.
Hello.
Yeah. Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah, so I was saying that the document I was following up. So there is a GitHub path mentioned for birth registration code. So I have cloned that code, but there are some file missing in that. It is showing like user service file is not there. So I was asking to, the exact GitHub path from where we can clone the code for
The birth
birth registration and Persister.
Okay, it is there in the OSS repository. I'm showing it here. This is where it is.
Yeah, I copied. Use the same.
Okay.
Still, in my code there are file missing, and I'm.
Files missing.
Can post in the discussion.
Yeah, please post in the discussion board, Gaurav. I think it's just the code is there. You can see it is here. So you can see that all this is here. So it's probably just a Git cloning issue, maybe. Just check it out.
So the YAML file, we need to use this spec one, birth registration API spec .yml, right?
Yeah, this is the API spec. Yeah, this is the API spec, and I'll also update. I added a few changes to it to make it simpler to understand. I will update this repository before end of day today. But yeah, this is the specification also. This is the specification. These are the Postman collections that we are using. This is your Persister configuration. This is your indexer configuration.
Okay, and the for Persister, we need to clone from core services, right?
Just clone the entire repository,
Yeah,
and
I
then
have.
and in
Entire
DIGITx, you will find core services, and inside this you will find the eGov-Persister.
Yeah, it is. I'm able to run it.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
birth registration, I was running this one.
Yeah, so this you can just run it locally. Just make sure you are modifying application.properties, make sure your DB is created.
Yes, yeah. All things are done. I'm just
Yeah.
I'm on birth registration one.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks, Gaurav. Please post whatever questions you have on the discussion board even after this as you try things out. That will also help us identify pain points and address them. Okay, anybody else has any questions?
There are a couple of questions in the Q&A tab. You can check it out if any of those can be addressed in this session.
MDMS service getting 400 in local VM setup. Persister and indexer pods are in crash back off loop because couldn't fetch the config files. Okay, so it looks like your Git sync containers are failing. Basically, you will have to fetch MDMS code from GitHub. This is something Aniket covered in his previous session. To access GitHub, you need to have SSH keys set up in your GitHub account. If the pod is unable to reach GitHub, then it is going to be in crash back off loop, both your Persister and your indexer pods. Okay, so make sure you have followed the steps properly, that you have added your access keys, SSH keys to your GitHub account, and then try it again. Restart the pod and try it again. And if you are facing further problems, please post on the discussion board and we will answer it from there. But yeah, definitely, I think this is a Git sync issue only. Your pods are unable to access GitHub and fetch the code from there. And that is why you are having this crash back off loop. Okay, thanks, Krishna.
Neha has a question around setting up.
Can you please describe the steps to fetch data from MDMS and index it to Elasticsearch for the dashboard? Okay. So indexer is something we didn't cover today, but it's very similar to the Persister. You have to write YAML configuration, right? And why would you want to index data from MDMS? Jiteshwar, maybe you can unmute him. Jiteshwar Pan.
Okay.
Dashboard.
Why from MDMS?
They want to enrich something.
Yeah, Jiteshwar, you can unmute and speak up to explain your query.
Jiteshwar, just to maybe answer your question, right? Your indexer also listens to the same topic as your Persister most often. So if you write indexer configuration to map the data to Elasticsearch, index, then, I mean, basically all you need to do is add indexer configuration, restart the indexer, and it will pick up the payload from that topic and put it in Elastic. So there is no special step. The step is writing indexer. So I can show you the birth registration indexer, what has been written. You can see that it is listening to the same topic as the persister. Okay. And then we are just, you can also enrich the data. From the indexer, you can call various services, enrich the data, and push it into the index called BT index V1. You can see some field mappings have been defined and all that, but that's pretty much it. If you want to know how an elastic index looks like and all that, then we'll have to get into more detail. But yeah, this is just mapping some things to a particular index and pushing that payload there. The entire payload, if you just push as is, it will get indexed into that index name called BT index V1. Jiteshwar, I don't know if you have unmuted, but I hope that answers your question. We'll have a future session, I think, on how to write indexer config.
I have given the path to the document.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Elsa.
I want to run all service locally. So I'm saying it's not advisable when they open touch upon.
Oh, yeah. Please don't run all platform services locally. Like I said, this is not an application. This is a huge platform. We've got 30 plus services. Generally, we discourage installing on laptops and things like that, because sometimes it may work depending on how much free RAM you have. Sometimes it may fail, right? So the ideal thing to do when you are developing a new module is to only run your module and maybe 1 or 2 services locally. And for the rest, use a digit environment.
And do port forward.
And do port forwarding, or you access it directly how you want to do it. But don't run everything locally. Okay, any other questions?
Something in the Q&A.
Q&A.
No chat.
Oh, chat, sorry. I've cloned the reports actually.
That is one of the front end.
I have cloned the repo after yarn installs Windows. Huh? Okay. Yeah, please post in the discussion board, Jugal Kishore. And that's where, because I think this is going to require some debugging in detail. So we can't answer it here, but please post it there, exactly what repo you cloned and all that. And then we'll try to answer
Put in the discussion board. That will be better.
Yeah.
Needs some time to.
Correct. So this is going to take some time. That's why we can't address it here. Please post it in the discussion board and we will answer it. Okay.
Great, then there is no other questions, and I think this is time. We close the session. Thank you, Subhashini, for the very insightful session on building a service on Digit. For participants, I have already put in a chat about our developer course that Subhashini had designed, and this is on YouTube. At the end of the course, you have an option to opt for a certificate. You have to submit an assignment for that. As I told you, we will soon going to launch a Digit Academy, and we'll keep you posted about it. There is a feedback at the end of the session. As the session ends, you will be redirected to a feedback window. Please do share your feedback. This will help us to design our future sessions as well as understand where do we need to enrich our platform. Thank you very much for the active participation. See you in the next session on 13th of June. Details are available on our open event page of core.digit.org. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.